Order. Elliot Colburn to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And I beg to move that this House has considered the permit variation process for waste incineration facilities. And can I first put on record my thanks to the Chairman of Ways and Means for selecting today's debate, especially at such a short notice change on the order paper. So I do really appreciate the opportunity to be able to bring this in front of Westminster Hall today. Could I also thank the Minister for attending today's debate. It's great to see her back in her place, and I know she would have heard many of the things that I'm about to say from her previous iteration in this role, not just here in Westminster Hall, but in the many conversations we've had. So I'm grateful that she's been willing once again to come and listen to me talk on this topic. But as colleagues will be aware, it comes as no surprise that the topic of my speech today is around the Beddington incinerator, which is hosted in my Carshalton and Wallington constituency. Now, this facility can currently process over 300,000 tonnes of non-hazardous residual waste a year, imported from 4 South London boroughs and from further afield, as well as, of course, from my own London borough of Sutton. Now, since the site completed commissioning in 2019, it has been bedevilled by problems, and my constituents suffer with a number of issues regarding this site to this day. The first of which is that the incinerator is statistically the #1 polluter in the London borough of Sutton. Emissions limits have been breached on literally hundreds of occasions, including over 20 incidences of CO2 and 40 incidences of volatile organic compounds, plus many more invalid reports. The promised Beddington Farmlands Restoration Project has been delayed again and again and again, and protected ground nesting birds have been killed to predators due to failures to keep water levels from being allowed to drop. Local roads have been damaged, congested and polluted by regular waste vehicle movements. The rise in NO2 gases from gas canisters and recreational drug taking has caused multiple explosions at the facility, risking the safety of the people who work there and, of course, pushing emissions limits up for every occurrence. And to add to this, the recycling rates have fallen by over 6% in the London Borough of Sutton alone. All of these problems and more I will delve into later in my speech. But I wanted to start by referencing the fact that barely 3 years since the site was first developed, and despite regular reassurances from the Lib Dem run council, and I note, Mr Efford, that not a single member of the Liberal Democrats have decided to turn up to this debate today, that we were given these assurances by the Lib Dems that this would not occur, and that when it was signed off, the operator would not have to submit any future variations. Well, surprise, surprise, Viridor has indeed submitted an application to the Environment Agency to make variations to its environmental permit to enable enhanced operations at the Beddington site. And what this means in layman's terms is that they want to burn more waste at Beddington, which will mean more vehicle movements, which will mean more emissions, which will mean more problems for my Carshalton and Wallington constituents. Now, the application for this variation was submitted way back in January, but the Environment Agency have only just now, in recent weeks, launched the public consultation on this application. Now, over the past 11 months, I've had various conversations with Viridor, with the council, councillors, community groups, and residents about these proposals. And during this period, it's become very clear that this application for an environmental permit are totally inappropriate. Now, I appreciate the Minister will be limited in what she can comment on, given that this is a live application undergoing consultation. However, I do want to just make some points. It is not the content of the application and the proposals alone that have sparked the need for this debate. But in addition to that, as serious as they are, I have found that the processes for determining these applications to be extremely limited when it comes to community engagement and influence, and I hope that we can discuss that particular element in more detail today. Now, the regulation of incinerators in England is split between the Environment Agency and local authorities, with the EA regulating incinerators with a capacity greater than 3 tonnes per hour for non-hazardous waste and 10 tonnes per day for hazardous waste, which has been the case for the Beddington incinerator in my constituency. And then incinerators below that are regulated by local authorities. Now, the environmental permit sets conditions on which limits the discharge to air, water and soil of specified substances. Now, these regulations require consultation of the public on some permit applications, but do not prescribe the methods of consultation, which can cause inconsistencies in the level of engagement that communities are offered around the country. Once an operator has an environmental permit, changes in the operation of the facility may require the operator to apply to vary the permit. Now, the operator must apply to the regulator to vary the permit conditions when proposing a change that would mean that a permit condition could no longer be complied with. And the Environmental Permitting England and Wales regulations of 2016 require the Environment Agency to consult for any new application or applications involving a substantial change. But despite potentially significant cumulative impacts on communities following permit variation, there is no mechanism to allow local authorities to directly influence the determination. Unlike initial applications for incinerators or other comparable major planning, environmental or licensing proposals, changes to conditions, communities are essentially frozen out of the decision-making process for permit variations for incinerators. The Beddington site was first given the green light by Lib Dem-run Sutton Council back in 2013. The environmental permit allowed for the processing of up to 302,500 tonnes of waste per annum. The variation to this was granted in December 2020 to allow for the processing of up to 347,422 tonnes of waste per annum based on the increase in availability. But Viridor is now looking for another increase to increase capacity to 382,286 tonnes per annum. This is a 26% increase in waste at the site since it was originally approved at application stage. In the last 12 months, slightly over 65,000 vehicle movements have been made to this incinerator. The draft proposed variations would increase projected vehicle movements to up to 76,000 movements per year. This is a 17% increase in vehicle movements. And despite these shocking figures and the significant impact the variation will have on this community, there is a noticeable lack of any discussion about the cumulative impacts of permit variations. Now, paragraph 47 of the government's planning practice guidance for waste highlights the importance of cumulative impacts of intensifying existing waste management sites and the need to engage with communities. And I quote directly from the guidance. It says, "The Waste Planning Authority should not assume that because their particular area has hosted or hosts waste disposal facilities, that it is appropriate to add to these or extend their life. It is important to consider the cumulative effect of previous waste disposal facilities on a community's well-being. Impacts on environmental quality, social cohesion and inclusion, economic potential may all be relevant. Engagement with the local communities affected by previous waste disposal decisions will help in these considerations." Now, despite this, the increase in traffic generated from intensifying incineration at the Beddington site cannot be taken into account by the Environment Agency when determining whether or not this application is appropriate or not. It's on the Environment Agency's website when you go to look up this application that residents are not allowed to talk about vehicle movements and the impact that the emissions will have of those when determining this application, because it's determined to be a planning matter. And the irony here will not be lost on Carshalton and Wallington residents that one of the Lib Dems' initial arguments for building the incinerator in the first place was to reduce the amount of vehicle movements that were needed on this site. Now, the incinerator has barely been operational for 3 years, and this is the second permit variation application to land on the Environment Agency's doorstep. And if this one is approved, what's to say there won't be another one or another one or another one years down the line? At what point does the intensification of this site and the cumulative impacts that it has on the community at large warrant an entirely new permit or a planning application? Now, residents in Carshalton and Wallington did not vote to burn more waste, and a bit more a few years later, and then a bit more a few years later. They did not vote to expand the reach where waste was supposed to be imported from and brought to our area, another borough, and then another borough, and then maybe another. They did not vote for more vehicle movements, potholes and exhaust fumes when they were originally told that vehicle numbers would fall. They did not vote for an increase in air pollution when they were told again and again that incineration is better than landfill. They did not vote to have Beddington Lane, which is the road that the incinerator is based on, permanently seeming to have roadworks going on, causing massive traffic displacement across the constituency. And now here we are at the precipice of another attempt to vary the incinerator's permit, a decision that will be taken out of local hands. Now, blame cannot be solely laid at the feet of the process or regulations that are being followed. The Lib Dem-run Sutton Council birthed the incinerator into our borough. They've been incubating it for years, and whilst turning a blind eye to scandal after scandal, betrayal after betrayal, until the grotesque expansion of the incinerator risks transforming Beddington essentially to the dumping grounds of South London. This was the Lib Dem vision for Carshalton and Wallington, one that never appeared in any election manifesto. There needs to be a mechanism in place to ensure that communities can have influence over these processes and that the determination of major and repeated permit variations, more so than just a single written consultation. Communities need to be able to hold regulators to account and those who determine these decisions to account, whether that be the local authority or the Environment Agency. Now, I've run my own petition to oppose Viridor's expansion plans and call for them to be dropped, and almost 1,000 local people have signed it already to say no. And I hazard a guess that this is far more people than will actually respond to the official consultation, because very few people are aware and there is no outreach engagement directly from Viridor or the Environment Agency about it. The application was submitted almost a year ago. There's been hardly any promotion, and now we're firmly in the middle of the consultation period, which ironically is now falling in the middle of Christmas, where people are going to be distracted by other things. Now, I am pleased, might seem odd, Mr. Efford, but I am pleased about something, which is that the Environment Agency has understood that the Beddington proposals are of high public interest and are proposing to hold a second consultation once this one has closed. However, there are other ways to improve engagement with the community, such as holding multiple public information events in residential areas and a public hearing to allow stakeholders to provide evidence in support of their views directly to the body that is making the decision. Now, these activities, whilst not perfect, would at least help community awareness and mitigate the feeling that this decision is being made by a faceless organisation far away from the local area. And separate to the process for determining and consulting on, there are, of course, other ways to mitigate issues surrounding the content of permit variation. And it is within the scope of the Environment Agency to assert conditions of permit variations that can do this. For example, a condition could be added to ensure that the operator installs metal detectors and magnets to extract any recyclable or harmful metal materials before they're burnt. Now, I've spoken previously in my speech about the scourge of nitrous oxide canisters, and I'm sure many other MPs will share their own experiences seeing these gas canisters being purchased legally and in many circumstances used to achieve a so-called legal high. And I'm sure people have seen these canisters littered across the streets. But these canisters need to be disposed of, and they end up into our waste stream and end up at incineration, where, when burnt and made contact with high heat, they explode. And once they've exploded, they can cause damage to the plant itself, causing massive operational difficulties. But that also presents a real danger to the people who work and live near the site. Now, Viridor has launched a public information campaign to make it clear that these canisters should not be put in residential bins. And I do absolutely support that, and I welcome those efforts, and I hope that we can send a message from this House today that we support those efforts to make sure gas canisters are not ending up in bins. However, I would go a step further. Viridor is already using metal detectors and magnets at another site to extract harmful metals. So I believe the Environment Agency should stipulate that installation of similar technology in Beddington must be attached as a condition to permit variation. And on a similar note, I still find it appalling that we do not understand how much recyclable waste is sent to incineration in this country. There needs to be clear, measurable recycling targets that operators must adhere to. And the proponents of incineration often point to recycling as a metric of their success and how they're better than landfill. Now, whilst the latter is certainly true, no one is disputing that at all, and no one wants to see a return to waste being put into the ground, as it is, of course, the worst of all options. But that same cannot be said for recycling rates and incineration. As landfill sites have begun to close and been phased out, incineration has picked up much of that demand, with incineration rising by nearly 4 times in the past decade, from just 12% to 44% of our waste management capacity. However, recycling rates have barely moved at all in the past decade, from just 37% to 43%, just a 6% increase. And that's not coincidental or unrelated. And according to very worrying research by the House of Commons Library, the data from 123 waste authorities shows a negative relationship between recycling and incineration. In other words, higher incineration means lower recycling and vice versa. And I've seen this firsthand myself, Mr. Efford, when I visited the incinerator in Beddington. Recyclable materials are going to find their ways into the wrong bin. Of course they are, but there needs to be processes to filter them out. And I've been informed of a number of investigations from other areas of England where specific recyclable bin bags have been sent to incineration. Indeed, there's been a local group in my constituency and in the boroughs in South London who have put tracking devices in bins and found that they have ended up in the incineration room at the incinerator. They're not being recycled, they've been shoved straight into being burnt. This is an absolute scandal. And research from Zero Waste Europe reveals that more than 90% of materials that end up in incineration plants or landfill could be recycled or composted. That 90%, that's huge. Even when energy is turned into waste, when recycling is still the better option. It can save up to 5 times the amount of energy produced from burning waste, which is not a renewable resource. It creates toxic pollution and potentially emits more carbon dioxide than some hydrocarbon-powered plants. In other words, incinerators need waste to have an effective business model, whether recyclable or not. Now, I really don't think you can call that recycling. However, there is some good news that could help us phase out incineration and which should be considered before any expanded or future incineration sites are approved. There is, of course, the deposit return scheme, which has seen recycling rates rocket in over 40 countries and is due to be rolled out here in the UK. And the Resources from Waste Strategy sets out the government's plans to reduce, reuse and recycle more than we do now. And I know the government's target is to eliminate all avoidable plastic waste throughout the life of the 25-year Environment Plan. Indeed, the groundbreaking and world-leading Environment Act of 2021 introduces the powers to bring in a deposit return scheme for drinks containers. And this will see billions more plastic bottles being stopped from being put in landfill or littered or incinerated. And I believe this will help to change consumer behaviours with the potential knock-on effects to other environmental activities, as well as reducing, of course, the need for more incineration. Now, I know, of course, DEFRA has consulted twice on introducing this in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, the most recent one being in 2021. And I understand that the ministers anticipate this being introduced in England, Wales and Northern Ireland in late 2024 at the earliest, subject to the outcome of the second consultation. But I'll be grateful for an update from the minister on this. But this does present a realistic yet ambitious timetable to ensure that DEFRA is implementing a DRS that will be as effective as possible in achieving the UK's objectives of boosting recycling levels, which will offer greater opportunities to collect higher quality, uncontaminated materials in greater quantities, thus promoting the circular economy and reducing the need for incineration. To add to this, the UK government does have plans to halve the amount of waste going to landfill or incineration in England by 2042. Therefore, it is my view that proposals to expand existing sites like the one at Beddington are in direct contravention of these ambitions. And if I could put some numbers on it, Mr. Efford, there is currently 15.6 million tonnes of operational incineration capacity in England. If consented capacity was built, this would grow to more than 28 million tonnes of operational capacity, while feedstock, which is the amount of waste going to be burnt, is expected to fall to about 13.4 million tonnes by 2042, so more than we currently have at present. This would mean we would have 14.7 million tonnes of English incineration overcapacity without any of the further 3.7 million tonnes of capacity which is currently in the planning system from being granted in the first place. Despite this, the Environment Agency is unable to take into account issues around national overcapacity when determining permit variations like the one for Beddington. Again, another cumulative impact of these proposals, which is being swept under the carpet, frankly, of Carshalton and Wallington residents. And I could speak all day, I think, as I've demonstrated, about the Beddington incinerator and the continued impact that it has on my constituents. But I do want to wrap up my remarks to allow other colleagues in and to hear what the Minister has to say. I would just end on this. Carshalton and Wallington has suffered as a result of continual failures from the Lib Dem Council to hold the incinerator to account. They forced it on residents in the first place, and now they're doing nothing about it. But now, due to the processes that are in place, we are at risk of being on the receiving end of even more waste, more vehicle movements, more incineration, and more emissions. There are alternatives to this and conditions that could mitigate the impact. So I hope that the Minister can shed a little bit more light on the work that the Government is doing to phase out incineration and introduce other measures such as the deposit return scheme. Carshalton and Wallington residents must have a voice in this debate, and they should have a say on whether or not it's their community, our community, that takes on more of South London's rubbish to burn. The motion states that the House has considered permit variation processes for waste incineration facilities. So we need to consider the cumulative impacts of this process and the impact of expanding incineration sites. The residents of Carshalton and Wallington have considered it. I have considered it. And I do not think that the process to vary environmental permits is working in the best interest